Hi, Eugenia. I'll make you now host, okay? See, 1 second, I don't hear you. Okay, let's go and leave meeting.
Recording. And hopefully Rabbi Groner was helping me with setting it up because I'm technically challenged. So hopefully he will not, I will not do anything wrong. So hello everybody and welcome. As I said, Rochel is flying, so she asked me to do the class. And I would like to talk about the concept of the king. Of course, the concept of the king is very closely connected to the months of Elul. As we discussed, the months of Elul is the very auspicious time, a beautiful time leading to the big holidays, to the Rosh Hashanah. And at the months of Elul, we say that the king is in the field. Meaning Hashem is not somewhere up in the palace, Hashem is coming up, the king is coming up in the field, the king is accessible, the king is in a good mood, the king is receptive to all the subjects and all their needs, to the extent that in the Song of Songs, King Solomon makes it a very romantic, really, the famous saying, Ani lidodi v'dodi li. I am for my beloved as my beloved to me. And that is a reflection of the fact that Elul is the month of love. It's we find our way back to Hashem and repair our relationships. And basically, that is described, that relationship is described as reciprocal. We give our love to Hashem and He's willing to open up and give our love to us. The whole story of the 40 days of the months of Elul and the Tishrei leading to the end of the holiday, basically considered by our sages as the love story. The story that started with us receiving the Torah with the chuppah, it's kind of likened to the relationship that the beloved, the groom and the bride would have, and they would have a chuppah. And then there was the split. There was the rupture in the relationship with the sin of the golden calf. And then, as we know, Moses comes up and asks for forgiveness. And in Elul, Moses succeeds to have Hashem to accept forgiveness. On Rosh Hashanah, Hashem agrees to recommit to become a king. We crown him as the king. On Yom Kippur, we have a chuppah. As there is a final forgiveness, Moses obtains the final forgiveness, and there is a chuppah, the wedding ceremony, and then we dance on Simchat Torah through the Sukkot. And Simchat Torah, we celebrate the wedding, we celebrate the restoration of the relationship. So all this all together leads to the fact that Hashem, as the king, is not considered as some removed, faraway monarch. Yes, we crown him, people crown him as the king on Rosh Hashanah, but basically as someone who's very close to us. The king who really loves, open up and loves each and every of his subjects, very close to their needs, and really wants to establish a relationship with his subjects. So all this is, even though we live in the times when, monarchy is something we consider as either at the best ceremonial or something that relegated to the pages of history books, we do understand that concept of Hashem as the king, as the sovereign of the universe. It's kind of sits well, I guess, with our understanding of the monarchy, when the sovereign who has the unlimited power. And we do understand that with all this closeness, with all this getting closer to Hashem in the months of Elul, leading to coronation of Hashem as the king for Rosh Hashanah, there is no in between. We know it since the time when Moses led people out of Egypt, and Hashem was saying, you are coming out to serve me. You're not serving anybody else. So Hashem is someone who is the sovereign, the only king. We say it in the prayers, in the holiday prayers, Aveinu Malkeinu Ein Lanu Melech. We say there is no other king. And we understand that Hashem doesn't require anybody in between. And yet something very, very curious occurs in today's Parsha, in this week's Parsha. The Parsha is called Shaftim, which means judges. So when the Jewish people are instructed how to build a very just and proper society as they settle in the land of Israel, they instructed to appoint judges, they instructed to appoint sheriffs. We understand that there should be law and order, and that there should be spiritual guides, right? That they appoint the priests and also the judges, someone who would be actually clarifying for the people all the laws that Hashem gave, all the mitzvahs, all the commandments that Hashem wants people to follow. This is quite understandable. And yet we read actually that people have a command to appoint the king, which comes as something very, very unexpected, as we discussed, that it seems to be that Hashem is the only king. So what's the need for the earthly king? Basically, that is a very strange command, and this is how it reads in the Parsha. When you enter the land that Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. So this is a very, very strange commandment. First of all, the words like all the nations around us contradicts the fact that the Jewish people are clearly told, you will be different from all other people. Particularly the world, you will be, not only you will be different, you will be holy to me. And the word holy, kadosh, actually means distinctive, set apart. So that is the one discrepancy. Why would the people want to be like everybody else? You're supposed to be different. You're supposed to be set apart, not like the nations around us. Second, is it's very interesting that these commandments are usually given unconditional. It's the commandment, it's a mitzvah, but this one is, interestingly enough, comes as the conditional commandment. It's only triggered when the people say, let us set a king over us. So why is that so? Why is there a condition attached to the setting up the leadership role? For example, when the Parsha talks about the setting up judges or the roles of the priest or a prophet, there are no conditions attached to it. And yet when it comes to setting up a king, there is a conditions attached to it. So I would like to share with you very interesting insight by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, when he discusses what is going on with this whole curious case of the Jewish kings, and why is that all of a sudden, when we were clearly told that Ein Lanu Melech, that Hashem is the only king, how come all of a sudden we are talking about the earthly king? And why are these kings different from the monarchs that we are accustomed to, that were ruling over the non-Jewish people? So the existence of priests in Israel did not depend on the people asking for them. As for the prophet, According to the Torah, the institution did follow a request from the Israelites. Having heard the voice of Hashem at Mount Sinai, the Israelites asked Moses to listen on their behalf and convey the divine word to them, because the direct experience of Hashem's voice was simply too intense for them to hear. Moses now tells the people that there will be prophets in the future also, but it will be God who will raise them up and put his words in their mouths. The initiative will not come from the people. So why is the appointment of a king dependent on people's request? There is another interesting discrepancy. In the description of the king, again, we're so accustomed that in the non-Jewish world, the monarch is all about power. So when we talk about the king, it's usually described what powers he possesses. If he has legislative, usually in the non-Jewish societies, unlimited legislative powers, the power of execution, whatever the powers are. And yet in the description of the Jewish king, there is no description of his powers whatsoever. Instead, curiously, the Jewish king is told what he is not what he is, but what he is not. So there is no, as I said, not a word in the Parsha about his role, his task, his mission. The restrictions, however, are set up very clearly. The king must not accumulate horses, wives, or wealth. So it sounds to me like the king had more restriction than anybody else, actually, because nowhere else Torah tells the regular citizens that they cannot accumulate any of those. But the king, those restrictions set up very clearly. So aside from prohibition to accumulate horses, wives, or wealth, he is to have the personal Torah scroll that he is to read all the days of his life and not deviate from its teachings to the right or to the left. He must be humble and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. These are all negatives, not statements of the positive purpose. The problem deepens as we trace the history of monarchy as described in Tanakh. The Israelites didn't immediately appoint the king after conquering the land. Instead, in times of crisis, they relied on charismatic leaders known as judges. And that gives the name of the Parsha, Shaftim, judges, who led the people in battle, but thereafter held no formal office. A classic example is the case of Gideon, who led the people in victory over the Midianites. The people sought to make him king, but he refused. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Even more perplexing is the account of the moment when the Israelites did request a king, as they did of the days of the prophet Shmuel. And Shmuel actually was very upset when the people came to him and requested to appoint the king. He considered Shmuel was a prophet, and at this time, judges and priests and prophets were the leaders of the nation. And he was upset by two accounts. First of all, he was upset because he considered that people were questioning his leading powers, his power of the prophecy. But also he was upset because it was formulated that we want to be like everybody else. So he felt that the people were requesting king for the wrong reason. And yet Hashem comforted Shmuel. He told him, "It's not you they rejected, but they have rejected me as the king." Hashem told the prophet to spell out the consequences of appointing a king. So instead of rejecting downright to saying you have only one king, it's Hashem and you don't need any kings, Hashem told Shmuel instead clarify to the people that when they appoint the king, they actually will be appointing someone over them who runs the danger of accumulating the power. And as we know, the saying goes that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So they're running all these risks. Nonetheless, if the people persisted in wanting the king, Shmuel should assent to their request. And this presents the obvious problem. If Hashem wanted the people to appoint a king, why would he say that it meant that they were rejecting him? If, to the contrary, Hashem didn't want them to appoint a king, why did he tell Shmuel to accede to their request? Eventually, Shmuel did appoint the king, and the monarchy was established. But the story is haunted by failure. King Shaul failed to carry out Hashem's command. King David, which we know one of the greatest kings, unified the tribes and established Jerusalem as the kingdom's capital, but committed a terrible sin with someone else's wife, with Bathsheba. His son Shlomo was very wise. He consolidated the kingdom and built the temple, but his failure was momentous. He disobeyed all the prohibitions set out in this parsha not to accumulate many horses, wives, or wealth. The sages spoke about it in a piercing Talmudic passage. Why were the reasons of the Torah laws not revealed? Because in two cases, reasons were revealed and they caused the great man in the world, Shlomo, to stumble. It's written, he shall not take many wives, lest his heart be led astray. Shlomo said, I will take many wives, but my heart will not be led astray. Yet we read, when Shlomo was old, his wives turned his heart astray. Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of men, thought himself wiser than the Torah. And that led to all the problems because after his death, his son wasn't really listening to the advice of the people of the prophets who were advising him to listen to the people. Basically, as the story goes, after Shlomo's death, the people came to his son and said, relieve us from the burdens and of the hard work. And King turned to his advisors and they told him to follow what people say, and he failed to listen to them. So that was already when the king started losing the humility, stopped listening to the people, forgetting that originally the Parsha said that you only appoint the king if the people ask him for them. So instead, that led to eventually to the disaster because the kingdom split in two and was in the northern kingdom and the Judean, and it was never subsequently reunited. These are extraordinary ambivalences, and they led to marked divergence of opinion among the sages and commentators into what kind of mitzvah is appointing the king. So there were different opinions among the sages, as they were totally puzzled and perplexed about this seemed to be strange mitzvah to appoint the king. Did Hashem really want Jewish people to appoint the king, or Hashem was against appointing the kings? That wasn't really clear, so the opinions split. According to Maimonides, the appointment of a king is a positive command. Maimonides was the big proponent of monarchy because he saw it as an ideal form of government, and he claimed. Yeah. Sorry, can someone mute themselves, please? Thank you so much. Basically, he claims that Hashem was angry with people in the days of Shmuel, not because they asked for a king, but because they asked for a king for the wrong reason. They said, we only want the king because we want to be like everybody else. So he saw it, but Maimonides was coming from the fact that eventually the form, he knew that in the time of Mashiach, the form of the governance will be monarchy. So he thought that was the right form of governance. Ibn Ezra, another sage, however, sees the appointment of a king not as the obligation, but simply as the permission. Not that you should appoint the king, but simply that you may. If you really, really want to appoint the king, Hashem concedes, okay, you can appoint the king as long as he satisfies the 5 restrictions, the main conditions that were described in the parsha. Sir Isaac Abarbanel, who among the medieval rabbis was closest to kings and queens, he was a diplomat in the service of a king of Portugal, Queen Isabel of Castile, King Ferdinand of Naples, and the Republic of Venice, held that the entire institution is only a concession to the human instincts. So basically, people just want to have a king over them, and Hashem consents, okay, you have to have the human king you made. This divergence reflects a profound tension that played itself not in the course of the biblical era. On the one hand, there is opposition in Judaism to the very idea of one human being exercising power over another. To me, the children of Israel are servants, says the Torah, on which the rabbis commented, but not the servants of other servants. In other words, not the servants of other humans. Rabbi Akiva said it most simply in the prayer Veinu Malkeinu, as we discussed, our Father, our King, we have no other king but you. We repeat it many times during the holiday prayers, right? On this view, there should be no need for a human ruler in the form of a king. Yet, in practice, this proved to be not a viable option. The book of Judges ends with a sentence, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So without monarchy, the alternative was anarchy. Hence the view of Ibn Ezra and Abarbanel that Hashem gave the Israelites permission to decide how they would be governed. And if they so choose, they will be permitted to appoint a king. Abarbanel's view is strikingly similar to that of an 18th century radical Thomas Paine, a key figure in both an American and French Revolution, who wrote, "Government, like dress, is a bunch of lost innocence. The places of kings are built on the ruins of powers of paradise." In the 20th century, Rav Kook, a very prominent rabbi who was the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of pre-state Israel, wrote that in the absence of a king, sovereignty returns to people who are empowered to choose the form of governments they prefer, including, if they wish, a democratically elected parliament. For him, the Knesset was the functional equivalent of a king, testimony that democracy is compatible with Judaism. There is undeniably another strand in Jewish thought represented by Maimonides that sees monarchy as an ideal epitomized in the finger of King David, a brilliant military tactician, adroit politician, and visionary statesman, and one of the greatest religious poets of all times, who wrote the beautiful Psalms, which I really consider it one of the most beautiful romantic religious poetry. With him, Hashem made an eternal covenant and thought the Davidic monarchy though the Davidic monarchy came to an end, its reestablishment is at the heart of the Jewish idea of the Mashiach, an anointed king on direct descent from David, who will restore Jewish sovereignty, rebuild the temple, and inaugurate the era of peace. Yet, in the pre-Messianic times, we are left with a significant distinction between the eternally valid and God-given laws of morality and halakha, and the time-bound nature of politics and government. And interestingly enough, we could now see the fundamental difference, despite all these different discussions, whether the mitzvah of the king was supposed to be the commandment that people should do, or just the concessions that if the people absolutely need to and want to, they could appoint the king. The Torah is very clear and sets, we could say, the revolutionary idea in the nature of the kingship, in the human kingship. It's definitely something that we would not see in the non-Jewish world of the past, or even non-Jewish world of the present, anywhere else. As we discussed in the non-Jewish world, basically the king is someone we associate monarchy with unlimited powers. And yet Judaism views the king, the Jewish king, is in a completely different terms. So aside from the setting up all the restrictions to the king, leads to the idea that the Jewish king, the Jewish leader, is supposed to be extremely humble, has to remember that he is servant of Hashem, but also that he is the servant of the people. And this is something that is fundamentally different. In many of the philosophies of the non-Jewish monarchy, people consider monarchs themselves, considering themselves that they were kind of divine representatives of God on earth, and people had to worship them. And yet Judaism turns everything upside down and looks at the Jewish monarch as the service of the people. Fundamental things that are set up for the Jewish king in Judaism is limitation, meaning Israel's king were the only rulers in the ancient world without the power to legislate. For us, the laws that matter come from God and not from human beings. To be sure, in Jewish law, kings may issue temporary regulations for the better order of society, but so may rabbis, courts, or local councils. The second idea that comes in Judaism is for the kingship and secularization. In Judaism, kings were not high priests, or high priests were not kings. There was that separation. So the king was supposed to be very humble, and the king was supposed to have, as we read at the beginning, his own Torah scroll, which he was supposed to read to remind themselves that they are who is the real king, so to speak, that they are serving Hashem, and also to be very well aware of the Torah laws. And yet all the words of God came from priests and from prophets, and kings themselves, again, such a contrast, such a difference. You know, when they talk about non-Jewish monarchs, nobody was probably brave enough to even say anything to them, for the danger of losing their head. But for Jewish monarchs, Hashem appointed prophets who were tirelessly coming to the kings and telling them the words of Hashem and telling them if the kings were doing something wrong. We know that in the case of Prophet Shmuel and King Saul, when Shmuel comes and said that to King Saul, that you actually failed to do what Hashem told you to do, we know that prophet Nathan, who spoke to King David, again, the prophets were not afraid to tell the kings if they were doing something wrong. And another very interesting aspect of the kingship is transformation. Fundamental to Judaism is the idea of servant leadership. One very interesting fact is that even during Shmona Esrei, you know, at the time when people bent down, and then regular, ordinary people straightened up, and they finished Shmona Esrei when they straightened up, and yet the kings were supposed to be saying the entire Shmona Esrei bending down. again, to remind them that they have to be exceedingly humble, and that the true king was Hashem in this world. There is a wonderful statement in the current year week's parsha, Shaftim. The king must have his own Torah scroll, and he shall read from it all the days of his life, not considering himself superior to the king's folk, or straying from the commandments to the right or to the left. Humility is the essence of royalty, because to lead is to serve. Failure to remember it caused what in retrospect can be single and most disastrous political decisions in the Jewish history that resulted in the split kingdoms and the following lost tribes. The radical nature of this transformation can be seen by recalling the two great architectural designs, symbols of the world's first empires. The Mesopotamian built ziggurats, and the Egyptian built pyramids. If you remember the shape, they're narrow at the top and very wide at the bottom, symbolizing that the king, someone who will be at the top, and everybody else, lots and lots of people at the bottom. So both of these monuments point out to the hierarchical society. The people are there to support the leader. The great Jewish symbol, the menorah, inverts the triangle. It's broad at the top and narrow at the base. The leader is there to support people. In contemporary terms, someone named Jim Collins, in his book From Good to Great, tells us, on the basis of extensive research, that the great organizations are those with what he calls level 5 leaders, people who are personally modest but fiercely ambitious for the team. They seek not their own success, but the success of those they lead. This is counterintuitive. We think of leaders as people hungry for power. Many are, but power corrupts. That is why most political careers end in failure. Even King Solomon's wisdom could not save him from temptations. And that leads us to the very powerful idea that comes from Judaism, that to lead is to serve. The greater your success, the harder you have to work to remember that you are there to serve others that are not there to serve you. So according to Judaism, this is the mark of a true leader, to serve people. And that's what we could now think of the rabbi who was actually 24/7 out for the people as the greatest leader, because he was, we know how on Sundays he would be standing for hours to bless people, to give them dollars, how he would be setting up the appointments even in the middle of the night for the audiences to listen to people. And this is really the mark of the great leader. And all the great leaders that we could think is throughout history were the ones who really were serving people rather than thinking of their own power. One very interesting fact also that Rabbi Sachs, it's actually a very interesting book I was reading you from. It's called Covenant and Conversation. And my Shmuel just brought it from Jerusalem. But very interesting fact that is pointed out is that parsha, that particular reading of what the king and what the true leader should be all about, became inspired the thinkers, the Western thinkers, who were later the fathers of the modern Western democracy. Interestingly enough, even though it talks about the king, but as we noticed, it tells two fundamental things. First of all, that people are the ones who decide whether they want the king. So it led the thinkers to the idea that it's not the king who appoints themselves or says that he's divinely appointed, or that the whole institution of monarchy is somehow woven into the fabric of the universe. Not at all. it says that Hashem is the king, and only if the people wish can you select and appoint the king. And not only that, that king has to be exceedingly humble and should be remember that he is the server of the people. And actually Hashem tells him through the prophets if that king is following the laws of God or if he's doing something wrong. And eventually this ideas led the Western thinkers to develop the whole concept of Western democracy. So I think that's something very, very powerful and something for us to take out of that. What are the qualities of a true leader according to the Judaism based on this week's parsha? Any comments? Anybody wants to add anything?
I want to say that this class was really superb.
Thank you
Very
so
nice.
much.
Very nice class.
A very good class. Very
Thank you.
interesting.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much. I would
Thank
like
you.
to
That was very nice.
thank you. I'm